Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth released in North America in 2016, bringing the Digimon brand of games back to the West. In terms of sales, it wasn't anything extreme, but more than enough to solidify Digimon back into the hearts and minds of players across the world. With its approachable gameplay, ease of Digimon raising, strong world building, and focus on story, it was able to bring the Digimon name back to players after many years. And after Sleuth came Next Order, a game I covered before Sleuth because it was an easier way to introduce Digimon as a brand, given the game was in the style of the original Digimon world. And it was a very unique experience, harkening back to the old style the series had been known for. I think because that video is nearly 3,000 years old. But anyway, with how well Sleuth did, it was inevitable that a follow-up story-styled game was on the way. But would they explore a new setting, or follow up to Sleuth? Well, they chose the latter, deciding to make a side story game that takes place at the same time to explore different angles of the setting while also exploring different themes and ideas, and even fill some holes in from the original. So today, we're talking about Digimon Story Hacker's Memory, and my god, no one talks about this one. Whenever I hear people talk about Cyber Sleuth, it's only about the original and never about this one. Was that because it was bad? Did they mess it up? Did it not live up to the original? Oh my god, they killed Digimon in the span of 2 games. Holy shit. Well, no. In fact, this is my favorite Digimon game released so far. So if not many people are going to talk about it, I may as well do my part, so come with me on this journey through Hacker's Memory. Let me start this review by covering some ground first. This is a different game, but it is using the same base as Sleuth, therefore it's a similar game in a lot of ways, from gameplay to music to locations, and a lot of basic things that made Sleuth good, and some of its flaws, are also in Hackers. Because of that, I'll be skimming over a lot of these to not repeat treaded ground, but I do want to cover some things. First off, one issue I did cover, but really didn't go into much depth in the original, was its reuse of repeated assets and repeated areas. I think the style of the game overcame it, but I still think it needed to be mentioned in the original review. This is very similar in Hackers, but I noticed they made an attempt at making more unique areas and taking advantage of the fact that most of these areas are in cyberspace and they can have a lot of creativity with them. So I do appreciate the work in this game that they did try and spice it up and add some new fun areas. Secondly, it reuses the already great soundtrack and adds on even more. For example, the new boss theme and domination battle theme is fantastic and exactly encapsulate what a Digimon boss fight should sound like. I should mention the same memory constraints in the previous game are here as well. I think memory isn't a bad idea to make sure you don't become too overpowered, but it should be set by rank and not be determined by some random dungeon pickups. When they do eventually make future story games, and if they continue using memory, I do hope they tie it to the story and not to anything else. Anyway, with those out of the way, let's actually get to the game. As I said before, Hacker's Memory takes place at the same time as the original, but instead of playing as the destined hero who becomes a cyber sleuth with the ability to enter cyberspace of any kind, we're just your normal everyday dude. We follow the story of a young man named Keisuke who got his Eden account stolen. In the world of Sleuth, a person's Eden account is incredibly close to their identity, and any malicious or mysterious acts that go alongside that can heavily damage a person's reputation. Because of this, Keisuke was effectively branded a delinquent and had his social life destroyed, and eventually he was contacted by the mysterious K, who gave him the option to seek out the account thief. During his hunt, he eventually comes across a digital black market in which he witnesses Digimon about to be deleted. Feeling bad for them, he stands up to them only to be challenged by a hacker there. Impressed by his guts, a well-known hacker from the Team Hootie named Ryuji steps in and recruits him and decides to help Keisuke in his quest to get his account back. Last time when I talked about the story summary, I said how one of the things that drew people to Sleuth was its dedication to its story, and while Sleuth does have developing characters, it is a narrative-focused story based on the Kamoshiro Corporation, Eaters, and Eden. In contrast to that, this introduction should show you how Hackers takes a divergent path narratively and decides to focus more on its characters, resulting in a character-based story. While he is mostly a silent protagonist, I actually happen to like Keisuke a lot. It's probably from burnout from overplaying so many RPGs, but it's always nice to get a protagonist who isn't the main predestined hero bestowed with powers on high. He's just a normal guy who got caught up in a mess beyond his control, and once in the mess and in a position to act, he decides to follow through with it. And even part of the game is seeing him going from some guy to a confident hacker in person. He's a much stronger protagonist narratively than the previous game's redheads, who are basically just bricks in human form. I also happen to have a soft spot for protagonists who are your everyday people. Another thing I liked is its dedication to its concepts. Sleuth didn't feel entirely dedicated to the Sleuth moniker, but Keisuke as a hacker in concept feels much more fulfilled. Huddy is a hacker handyman team, which deals with any job requests people can throw at them, and Keisuke does a great job at dealing with problems and working with others. And often at the end of cases, he'll go above and beyond to help the client or another character in need, and it makes him likable, and it makes an extra step at selling me the setting and him as a member of this freelance team. But Keisuke isn't perfect, and when he needs help, he can handily call upon the help of his Huddy teammates. Ryuji, the strong-willed, stoic leader and well-known hacker, Chitose, a kind hacker who keeps the group together, and Erika, Ryuji's younger sister, a hacking genius and prodigy who starts off cold and closed off, but opens up to us as the game goes on. Very often, Keisuke will be calling upon the help of or working with his team members, and when I said Hackers was narratively a character-driven experience, they absolutely come into play too. For example, Ryuji seems like a harsh person at first, but he's incredibly caring of those around him and is devoted to enacting his own sense of justice. And Chitose is a regular old flirt, but an all-around good guy who keeps the group together and works well with most people he meets. Erika, though, is the most covered one. She starts off cold but warms up to you and becomes an incredibly close and integral part of the game's narrative as it goes on. And what I like about her is the progression feels natural. I think when it comes to the tsundere archetype, everyone can attest that a lot of the examples are handled painfully, even verging on what could be considered abusive behavior. Where instead, Erika's progression feels a lot more natural as she opens up to you over the course of the game and ends up being a really nice bond between the two. It should be said what really makes me like this cast so much, especially in contrast to the original Sleuth, is how they are constantly at your side developing and working alongside you. The original Sleuth cast was good, and I liked them a lot, but on occasion they would just yeet themselves out for a while and develop off screen, and ironically enough, some of that is seen in Hackers. Even side characters like Faye, Date, and Matayoshi, who felt like afterthoughts in Sleuth, get a good amount of more prominence here, which is pretty refreshing. Compared to the Sleuth gang, Huddy feels like a genuine team with them spending time and growing together throughout the game. And when it comes to the progression of the game's story, it's less about pursuing a single goal, and more about how all of these problems in the world's story affect these respective characters at a given moment. Because of this, I used to consider the game's story unfocused in a similar way of how I felt about the second half of Cyber Sleuth. But on this replay, I kinda started to see it a different way. Because it is character-driven, the villain and problem of the chapter feels a lot more natural as the game is focused on characters reacting and dealing with the current problems around them, rather than some end goal. Because of this, you may think that it would be hard for a game like this to have a strong ending, as it may not have a clear endgame in mind throughout. But needless to say, despite the ending being one of the few things I see people actually talk about with this game, and not in a good way, I personally think Hackers managed to have one of the most powerful and emotional endings in recent memory. And it is one that has stuck with me since my original playthrough until today. I won't even begin to go into why, because I'd hate to spoil it, but I would recommend playing the game to find out if you're interested, because the writing, at least for me, is superior to the original and a great time. And you know, remember last time when I said that Sleuth felt like an original anime season made into a game? Well, let's push that metaphor even further. Hackers is the season 2 that now that Sleuth has done the straightforward Digimon tropes in Season 1, Hackers can explore different and alternative ideas and plot points in Season 2. And because of that, it feels a lot more refreshing to me as a longtime Digimon fan, but because it decides to go for a character-centric plot over a narrative one like Sleuth, it allows both games to stand on their own. And while I pretty evidently prefer Hackers, there are people out there that prefer Sleuth, and honestly I'm happy we live in a day and age where we can have two unique Digimon games with two unique stories and their two unique strengths. Hackers does have its own slew of issues though. First off, it can be very dense at points writing-wise, which while I enjoy, can be a lot to read at one time. Even I had to take breaks at points because cutscenes and events can go on and on and on. Its pacing can also feel off at points, with some chapters being very long and others being a literal blink. This alongside some of the plot points you want to be longer or get covered more, or ones that just don't get enough prominence. And then you have the inevitable issue of, if you don't like the characters, there's not much to stick you to the story since it's mainly about them. I happen to, but like I said, Hackers is more experimental and not everyone will be into it. For what it's worth, Sleuth not only went for a safer direction, but also had superior pacing on the whole. That also said, I also have a soft spot for Hackers because it goes out of its way to reference a lot of different Digimon properties from various anime series to other games and even some of the mangas. The original had various references as well, but it was also more adventure and Royal Knight focused, which for Pokemon fans watching is basically the Gen 1 pairing of Digimon. So for me as a lifelong Digimon fan who has experienced a lot of its media over the years, seeing these get recognition is honestly really heartfelt to me. And if we're being honest, that's kinda how I feel about Hackers as a whole. It isn't a story that needed to be told, as the original did a fine enough job of fleshing out the world and telling its story. But in a way, that's what's appealing to me. It's a story that, while wasn't necessary, someone wanted to tell. Someone wanted to explore more of this setting, more references to older Digimon properties, more of these characters, and do something completely different than the original. It reminds me a lot of the old Majora's Mask story, where Aonuma wanted a more interesting and unique experience than just an expanded Ocarina of Time. And like here, instead of just getting a regurgitated experience, we have something, while similar in look, feel, and play, different in execution. And they both complement each other well. Instead of being the heroes destined to save the world, they're instead people caught up in circumstances beyond their control and trying to do the best they can for themselves and those around them. And something about that is just beautiful to me. It's funny how a story about people using digital gun dragons ends up feeling more human than a lot of stories out there, but it was to my surprise. I think one of the reasons I like it so much is that it isn't anywhere near the best written or best RPG out there, but it felt genuine to me, and narratively and emotionally beyond every Digimon game I had played before. Now, I should admit that part of this experience comes from my bias as a lifelong fan of the series, and it's hard for me to gauge if others can even have this experience. But I still want to share some part of this feeling with all of you watching at home, especially if you can't naturally have that experience. I mean, that's one of the core aspects of making these kinds of videos in the first place, right? Not only talking about games, but also sharing those experiences with one another in order to give other people potential feelings and experiences they may not ever be able to have. No one will ever play every game, but we can all help each other fill in some of those gaps and experiences. And with all that said, I feel like I've talked enough about the story to give you all a general idea without really going into any spoilers, aka I just talked about generic and surface level stuff without invoking any specific examples, but that's kind of the nature of reviewing something like this since, like I said at the beginning, it reuses a lot from Sleuth, and I really don't want to spoil anything. If you're really interested, just play it! That all said, there are some new additions to the game I want to go over before we finish. First off, the Digimon additions are absolutely fantastic. The Dracomon line is one of my favorites and not in many games, making their appearance here all the more impactful. The Spirit Digimon from Frontier are great as well, and there are a lot of other good additions here and there, like the Dracmon line, the new Durandolmon line. It took an already great roster and made it even better, and I should mention that if you get the dual pack version, Sleuth will have all of these included as well, but I wanted to give Hackers a pat on the back first since it debuted all of these. As for the gameplay, the real big addition are domination battles, 3-on-3 grid-based battles where you and two teammates have to control more points or some other requirement to win. These are refreshing pace breakers that throw spice into the normal gameplay and also immerse you more into the world of Hackers, as it's effectively their way to resolve issues if they can't talk the problem out. Who needs diplomacy if you can just use violence? Thanks, Namco Bandai. It's also fun because you get to control different party members and see what kind of Digimon they themselves raise, like Ryuji raising dragons and Chitose raising this little shell guy. The mode adds immersion as well because it shows that not just you, but every hacker out there is raising their own unique team of Digimon favorites. It's not revolutionary or anything, and I'd even argue they needed more unique win conditions, but honestly the gameplay of Sleuth and Hackers itself is already good, and these battles are just an extra cherry on top and make it more unique, especially if you decide to raise broken Digimon, as you can't always brute force your way through it and have to use that good old strategy. In general though, even outside of these team battles, Hackers will have you very often be accompanied by NPCs that will interact with the story and help you in fights, and even can be called upon for certain side missions, adding on to the more character-driven focus of the game, and it gives it a very different feel than the original. That being said, it is also very funny when the partner they give you is weak to the boss and does negligible damage, but hey, they're glorified meat shields, so I can't complain too much. And on the whole, I feel like Hackers was in general a bit easier, but in retrospect I had the entire original fresh in my mind while I played, giving me more experience right from the beginning. Not only that, my final party member choices in this game were much stronger than the original, showing how varying the experience can be both in this and the previous game, based off which Digimon you decide to raise. I also felt like I had my team of Megas for longer in this game compared to the original, which I really liked, because it meant I could use my final team more. But they still do need to do a better job at balancing special moves in future story games so every final team can feel strong and not just me using power picks. But still, like last time, maybe despite some endgame enemies having high HP, it really doesn't affect the game that much. And I would put my final note being that, the gameplay system is the same, and even though they do add, new things here and there, that if you do get both games from the dual pack, or you buy them both separately, or you get them from mysterious means, to maybe separate your playthroughs a little bit, just so you don't get burnt out. I know Hackers isn't the game of a generation, but I really did enjoy it a lot more than I thought I would when I first played it, and even revisiting it, it was still a really good time. If you're at all interested in Digimon and getting into the series and games, Sleuth and Hackers are such a good 1-2 punch for getting you into the series. On Steam and Switch, you can pick them up together. They're more than worth the asking price, but they also go on sale like every other month too, so if you're a bit crunched for money, I'd say wait, and before you know it, they'll be cheap again. And sadly on PS4, you can only get Hackers easily, as Sleuth was delisted from the PSN, so for PS4 players, you'll still have to find a physical copy to play Sleuth. And for all 7 remaining Living Vita owners, you can also download Hackers and perhaps do some questionable things to play Sleuth now as well. But what about next time? Well, Digimon Survive is now finally out, being the next step for Digimon games, so I will be getting to that game very soon, but in the meantime, or even after, I want to try getting to more games as well, and maybe even trying out some different kinds of videos too. Which comes first? I don't really know. But whatever happens, whether it's Survive or something else, thank you all for watching this video, and I hope to see you all again soon.